Hello and welcome to Jadwiga's Fairy Tale channel. Who lives in the skull? This is a beautiful little story from Russia, but I think the English translation is very cute. So I don't know the Russian original, but I know the German translation and I don't like that very much, so I tell it in English. And I did that already once with some translation help in German. But this time I will just tell it in plain English. Who lives in the skull? Once upon a time there was a skull, a horse's skull. And since it had been lying on top of a hill since many, many years, its outside was washed as white as marble, and its inside was as hollow as a seashell. One day a mouse came along, saw the skull, and thought to himself, this skull would make a nice home. So he knocked on the bone and said, "Hello, this is Mr. Twitchery, Switchery, Nibble by Night. Does anybody live in that skull?" There was no answer. So he moved in, he set up home, and very snug it was. One day a frog came along, saw the skull and thought to himself, this skull would make a nice home. So he knocked on the bone and said, "Hello, this is Mr. Poppety Ploppety Peddle the Pond. Does anybody live in that bone?" "Only me," came the answer. "Only me, Mr. Twitchery, Switchery, Nibble by Night. Come in, here's room enough for two." So the frog moved in, they set up home together, and very snug it was. One day a hare came along. He saw the skull and thought to himself, this skull would make a nice home. So he knocked on the bone and said, "Hello, this is Mr. Lollopy Gallopy, King of the Corn. Does anybody live in that skull?" "Only us, Mr. Twitchery, Switchery, Nibble by Night, and Mr. Poppety Ploppety Peddle the Pond. Come in, here's room enough for three." So the hare moved in, they set up home together, and very snug it was. One day a fox came along, saw the skull and thought to himself, this would make a nice home. So he knocked on the bone and said, "Hello, this is Mr. Knifery, Thief of the Coop. Does anybody live in that skull?" "Only us, Mr. Twitchery, Switchery, Nibble by Night, Mr. Poppety Ploppety Peddle the Pond, Mr. Lollopy Gallopy, King of the Corn. Come in, here's room enough for four." So the fox moved in, they set up home together, and very snug it was, if a little squashed. One day a wolf came along, saw the skull and thought to himself, this would make a nice home. So he knocked on the bone and said, "Hello, this is Mr. Slavery Slandering, Tongue on the Tilt. Does anybody live in that skull?" "Only us, Mr. Twitchery, Switchery, Nibble by Night, Mr. Poppety Ploppety Peddle the Pond, Mr. Lollopy Gallopy, King of the Corn, and Mr. Knifery, Thief of the Coop. Come in, here's room enough for five." Now the wolf moved in, they set up home together, and very snug it was, if very squashed. So one day a bear came along. He saw the skull, knocked on the bone and said, "Hello, this is Mr. Cumbersome Sumbersome, sit on a log. Does anybody live in that skull? Inside of the skull, Mr. Twitchery, Switchery, Nibble by night, Mr. Poppity Ploppity Peddle the pond, Mr. Lollopy Gallopy King of the corn, Mr. Knavery Knivery Thief of the coop, and Mr. Slavery Slandering Tongue on the tilt. They looked at each other. They saw there was no more room. And all together they shouted out, "No! Nobody lives here! Nobody at all!" "Oh, that's fine," said the bear. And he sat down on the skull. He sat on top of the lot of them and oh, whether any of them got out in time or whether they didn't, I don't know. But what I do know is that this bear still today is pulling out tiny white splinters of bone out of his backside. Who lives in the skull?